So welcome back, everyone. Again, we're here with Olivier Marboeuf and Louis Henderson, two of the directors of the Living and the Dead Ensemble. Thank you both so much for this really beautiful and rich film. I feel like the last time I saw films in cinema was in Berlin, where you premiered this film and all of the members of the ensemble were there. But doesn't that feel like over ages ago, right?
Yeah.
Another lifetime before the pandemic. So I thought we could begin by speaking about the motif of the spiral, which I think is this really beautiful concept that kind of recurs in the film in many different ways. I love how one of the characters speaks about it as it being rooted in the earth and growing up towards us. And I think it's used to talk about the way you all have been thinking about Haitian history, but also I think it works beautifully as a way to think about the form of the film itself and maybe also the process. And I also was noting that in another conversation, they're talking about how Haitian Creole itself as a language kind of works as a spiral. So yeah, I think it's a really rich place to maybe start, and there's so much to say about that.
Yeah, that's difficult to know. How do we begin? I mean, maybe I'll say some things off the top of my head, and Olivier can probably, maybe I can tell some of the more anecdotal and pragmatic things about how the spiral got incorporated into the work, and Olivier could probably tackle some more of the sort of philosophical implications that are specific to the Caribbean, particularly the spiral's relationship to Caribbean literature. Maybe if you want to talk, I don't know, that's up to Olivier to decide. But I can just say, I mean, for us both, really, the spiral was something that we were very interested in from an early stage. Actually, I think from even works, even before we were making Ouvertures, Olivier and I had already both been engaged in a conversation around the work of Édouard Glissant, the philosopher and poet and playwright from Martinique. And actually, I think it's in Poetics of Relation, which is his book from the 90s, he writes about that as if he calls it a spiral retelling of the book Caribbean Discourse that he wrote in the 80s. And then actually, for Édouard Glissant, the spiral is in a very important motif in the way that he thinks about his own literature, in the sense that, so Glissant is interested in doing what he calls in French a détour, which is, I mean, same in English, we say detour. But the way in French it's interesting because détour, it sounds like retour. So you don't have a return, but you have a detour. So not a retour, but a détour. And for Glissant, this détour, so it's about coming from one point in time back round to the same point in time. But rather than making a full revolution, like a circle, you do a spiral. So the return would be like a revolution, which in some ways keeps people positioned in history and they don't seem to move on from that point. It's about eternal repetition. Whereas a spiral, as a détour, brings you back to the same point, but by way of another route. So you kind of come back to the same point, but at one remove. And actually a spiral is almost like how a screw turns and moves forwards. So it's also a way for Glissant to think about how repetition and echo are ways that you can deal with historical time that might then project you forwards into a different conceptual or philosophical or social space. So I think this was something that both Olivier and I were thinking about in different terms, in different forms, but specifically in relationship to film narration and how we could think of films that would look at history to bring us forwards to a different point in time. But I don't think we'd ever necessarily put that in the form of the spiral, but we were definitely interested in this work of Glissant that Glissant calls the détour rather than the retour. and how that came into what he calls a spiral retelling. And then, so that was an interest we had, and we had been discussing how could the film Ouvertures itself follow a sort of spiralistic narration? How could it begin at one place or one point in time? In the film that in Ouvertures, it begins in France, and that French section in the Jura ends in a cave. And then from that cave, we spiral out, the narrative comes out into Haiti, but actually it brings us back to the cave at the end. But the cave this time is a very important cave in a place called Port-à-Piment in Haiti. The cave is called Grotte Marie-Jeanne. And it was a cave that was an important place actually during various different, struggles throughout the history of Haiti, from the indigenous struggle to the different liberation movements of the enslaved people in Haiti. And so the film itself, anyway, we were trying to think of it how that could take the form of a spiral. And then actually one day we were in the car having one of our long discussions with members of the group, of the ensemble. Particularly at this moment, we were talking with Léonard and James Desiris, and we were talking about our interest in the spiral and Glissant's spiral retelling and modes of narration. And then Léonard said, actually, I've been thinking about the spiral in this way. And James said, well, actually, the spiral is an important emblem and motif in voodoo culture in Haiti. And he gave us more. So we started to see that actually other members of the group were very interested in this form. And then that's how we then developed actually those two scenes that are improvisations based on, sort of short pieces of writing that both Léonard and James had done on the spiral. That's sort of how the spiral kind of came into us trying to understand, modes of narration and improvisation in the film. And then the interesting thing happened was that then James started to tell us more, or Léonard actually, to tell us more about the movement of spiralism, which was a literary movement. Maybe Olivier can tell us a bit more about that and what the sort of philosophical and aesthetic implications of spiralism were basically in Haiti in the 1960s.
Yeah, I think, as we said, and we can, I think, do it with all the motif of the film. And so there is different way of, let's say, developing from a single motif a lot of different interpretation in a sense that in a translation, but also as you can interpret in the sense of performing something. So the idea of the spiral is also that kind of idea that different members of the ensemble can perform and imagine in different ways, because we didn't use a philosophical idea to just bring it in the film really consciously. It's more, as Louis says, some conversation, ideas, and desire that we bring with us, and it makes the film, because in certain way we are really to confess, but I think in a good sense that the film is really a kind of practice of creating some situation to work with ideas. So it's not that kind of, it became a kind of well-structured films, but taking as a point of departure a kind of chaotic situation. And that is, I think, the base for the writer of the spearism movement, and the most well-known of them, which is Franck Etienne. And he says to take, and it's something common with Glissant in a way. He says, I think European literature is really based on a kind of inscription of a kind of verticality of the language, because there is a kind of floor, which is the nation state. This is a kind of ground or soil from where the ideas and a lot of different writing have been developed. But us in Haiti, we are coming from a chaos, and it's really a state of mind. It's a way of living. So taking the chaos as a point of departure is a proposal of Franck Etienne and other writers that are in the same movement. And so the spiral is also the way to learn to live with a certain kind of chaotic space, instead of having some really project and linear projection. It's more trying to live with the movement of the world, including earthquake, including social rebellion, including a lot of things. So there is that idea of practicing and living with the chaos. And I will say the production of the film have been inspired by that attempt not to control things, but try to live with those things. And the last really short thing to say about Spiral, and it's also coming from Glissant, is talking about that, and I think for me it's really at the end, with time, one of the most important things that stay out also in the film, is talking about the spiral as a way to creating an idea about accumulating some matter. So it's really the opposite of that idea of the vertical philosophy of the Western modernity, I would say. Mm-hmm. It's more the idea that you begin a process of saying, and the sense is coming not from a really clear idea, but with the accumulation of different voices, matter, eyes, and so there is a kind of phenomenon of apparition of the ideas. And so I do feel the movement of the ensemble is also the movement of creating the sense of the film. So it's really accumulating a lot of different scenes. And at the end, I do think, and we do hope that the viewer got a kind of global sense, but it's appear step by step. It's not as a linear storytelling with beginning and middle and end. And I will say the film is beginning not from the beginning, it's beginning from somewhere, which is, it could be the middle, because there is a series of repetition in there.
Mm. There's also just one, sorry, just quickly, one anecdote as well, just because it explains nicely how we decided to make the film. So the film is quite, there's a lot of different levels of writing and lots of engagement with text. We engaged with the text of Édouard Glissant. We engaged with scenes that were written by the group, scenes that are improvised off written text, etc. But also this thing about conversation. We would talk between us, and then things would come up, and then we would decide to shoot them. And sometimes you're very lucky. So in that last scene, one of the last scenes is James and Leo walking near the sea, and Leonard talks about this group of Haitian poets who formed this group called the Spiralists in the 1960s. And he mentions, Franck Etienne, who's this poet that we've become very interested in recently. And actually, at the time, we were trying to make a film about these group of young actors who are rehearsing a play. And as they rehearse the play, they start to get overtaken by the characters that they are like trying to rehearse and act. And it starts to become unclear who's speaking from which position at what point. And like Olivier says, it's a calm and easy to understand, but generally kind of chaos. It's a sort of chaos, or what Glissant would call a kind of chaos monde, a chaos world, a chaos monde. And so we were interested in how each character could have differing levels of subjectivity in that sense, like different personalities. And then Franck Etienne, neither Olivier or I had read Franck Etienne before we went to Haiti. It was from speaking with the group of Haitian actors that we discovered his work. And then when I left in 2018, I read Franck Etienne's first novel, which is called Ready to Burst. And in that novel, he tries to do exactly what we were trying to do with the film. The novel is precisely a play on language and narrational techniques to give the characters in the book fractured and multiple states of identity. So you're never quite sure if they're talking from themselves or from the characters they're playing in the novel. So it's this constant shifting. And so then actually we kind of figured that we were making a film on the same aesthetic grounds as Franck Etienne's spiralist novels, or what he calls actually roman spiral, like spiral fictions. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that was just a nice thing that when those things come together, not really by chance, more because of some creative energies being in the same place at the right time. Yeah.
Can we maybe back up a bit and hear a bit more about all of the members of the ensemble who are performers, actors, most of them based in Haiti. I believe a couple of them are now in France. But just how this group came together, and also a little bit about the original theater performance that you all did back in, I think it was 2017 for the biennial that was there in Port-au-Prince.
Yeah, I think there is different things to say about that. Firstly, it's something that people don't really know if they don't really know Haiti, but it's really a real paradoxal place, because, for instance, poetry, literature, theater is really, really important in Haiti. It's a super artistic and culturally productive island, I have to say, even for the region. So there is a lot of problem in Haiti, socially, politically, economically. But despite all this problem, there is really a place of literature, of theater, of writing, and poetry also. We are as a really central art, which is really incredible. And it's really incredible. There is a huge production and huge practice. So all those, the young people have been included in a lot of different small or big projects about playing theater here, writing here, do a slam session. But some of them were friends, but it's mainly Rossi Jacques Casimir that created that first group for the project. And they really getting used, to go from project to project to trying to find a way to work with the heart. But yeah, I think the first moment we met them, it was really with the first kind of, let's say, workshop. So finally, the fact that all those people, including us, are still here as an ensemble is a consequences of something. It was not really a clear project. It was just we asked to Rossi to have a first group to make a workshop of reading, and really quickly we discovered that the translation will be central too, because the play Monsieur Toussaint by Édouard Glissant was in French. And so for them, it was really important to translate it to Haitian Creole, because most of the people on the island are speaking Haitian Creole. So the idea also to have a connection with the project, with the local audience, was suddenly super central. So it changed also what we did during that workshop, that became really mainly a translation workshop. But that process of translating was already a creative process. And so we discovered it step by step. But it's also our capacity along the project to accept everything happening as a matter of a potential film that create Ouverture at the end. Because each time there is new things that happen, and the film is really also a way to meeting other people, because in fact it tells also a process of a kind of collective gathering, because we are not friends and we are not working all together before that process of film. So the process of being together is really also central. And so during the film is nice, because when I saw recently the whole film, it was a long time I didn't watch it, and so you really see that they are super young in it, because it's 3 or 4 years ago, and that's just funny. You find him young, because now they are different, and now we know each other much better. So we remember that at that point, and that is also the process of the film, it was not clear for them what they were doing there. At some point at the beginning, they said, okay, let's do that. And so it's also for them a process of understanding a kind of idea of the film, which is also central, because in fact says, okay, they accept to do something. Okay, let's do that, let's try that. But of course, because it's a non-conventional way of making film, some of them afterwards confess that it was really impossible for us to understand what the fuck we were doing. And so it's funny. There is also that process of
not that either of you really knew what was happening either, right?
Yeah, it was not so clear for now. Yeah, but normally you got the authority of saying, we know what we are doing, because we are filmmaker, producer, so we are there to give some. And in fact, at some point they understood that it was not clear for us neither. So it was weird for them, and so we are. But it created that collectivity. In fact, a certain kind of weakness at some point became create the possibility of being a community instead of being only people that shooting other people. being together is based on the fact we were lost at some point. And the fact we're lost is also the process that Louis talked just before about Franc-Etienne literature. Being lost is a part of the process of being together too.
But actually, that's a really nice way to say it, actually. Being lost is a way to be together, because so, and I can tell this anecdote. It's an anecdote that Olivier used to like telling, in fact, which was so we were, so Port-au-Prince is a large sort of spread out city, and traffic and transport can be sometimes quite difficult. And the way that Olivier and I decide to make work politically and economically, those two things go together. Like, we're not the kind of people with private drivers and air-conditioned cars. So we would just take public transport everywhere, obviously, with equipment, and because it's just me and Olivier and someone doing sound, you know, and then the rest of the group. But where we would stay was in the center of town, and where we would rehearse and shoot was like very far away in a part of town called Carrefour. And one time we got there, and there was this huge storm and this enormous traffic jam. And the traffic jam rendered it impossible, absolutely impossible, to get back to where we were staying. So there was a sort of group decision, and it was nighttime. It was pitch black and pouring with rain. And the group was like, well, we have to walk. We're going to have to walk. But the walk was like 4 hours, I suppose. I think a 4-hour walk in pitch black, in full torrential Haitian rain with, you know, anyway, but as a group. And Olivier and I had never really walked that distance in the dark in Port-au-Prince before. But, you know, the other 8 members of the group who were from Port-au-Prince assured us that this is, you know, that if we stick together, we can do this, we can get through it. And I remember we just walked non-stop, extremely fast, in the middle of the traffic jam for 4 hours down these highways. And everybody just kind of making sure constantly that Olivier and I were not taking the wrong direction or falling into a hole in the road. Or,
because there is real holes in the road.
Huge holes. So it was this very amazing process by which we were, for Olivier and I, let's say, we were kind of completely lost in the sense that we're in a city we didn't know at that point very well. We didn't know the way home. And yet we were all guided as a group. There was even one moment, I think, we didn't, but it almost felt like we're all holding hands walking through this space. And in fact, I think it's moments like that where we spend 4 hours walking in the middle of the night in the pouring rain together as a group that actually really does create something very unique and that can't be created through other forms of film production, perhaps, where the filmmakers are kept so separate from the people that they're making the film about and with. And, you know, anyway, I just mentioned that story because when Olivier and I first went to Haiti, we had both already been discussing the possibility for a type of cinema that could somewhat, you know, deconstruct the typical modes of authorship in cinema, and how there's always this focus on the sort of singular author. The art world and the cinema world are so keen on singular names, on singular authors. And Olivier, I know, had been working for, 18 years or something, running this art center in the outskirts of Paris called Chiasma that was very much focused on collective work, trying to think about how to produce things in sort of multiple voices. And since about 2015, I had been also working with Olivier at Chiasma on these kind of multi-authored projects. So we went to Haiti to try and make that happen. But we never planned what that would be, or who the group would be, or how the group would take shape. And actually, the ensemble very much, it just sort of, we all formed around the production of the play, I would say first, the Monsieur Toussaint by Édouard Glissant, that we did, for the Ghetto Biennale. That was on an invitation from Leah Gordon, who actually organizes the Ghetto Biennale with André Eugène, who's a Haitian artist. Leah is an artist and a curator and a writer from London. And she's been organizing the Ghetto Biennale for some time. And, she invited us to come and perhaps do the play as part of the Biennale. So we did that 2017, and I think the concentration, the focus of us coming together to at least do that thing, because initially I wanted to make a film about a group of actors rehearsing a play. And Olivier had said to me, but we have to put on the play. We have to do the play. You know, again, normal film production, they would just ask actors to rehearse a play and we would film them. But in our method, which was, well, this time was more like ethical, because in terms of economics, it doesn't make sense because you have to put a lot of money into making the play. So we put on the play, and then the film, and Olivier kept on saying to me, don't worry about the film. Let's focus on the play. And then we do the film later. And doing the play, I think, is what actually made the group. It's what formed this ensemble. Yeah, it was because of that it was possible to make the ensemble. And then from there, you know, the film kind of followed.
Yeah. I really love the anecdote of the walking through the rain at night. And I think it transitions really nicely to a question I had for you, which is kind of about how I find that the film kind of all lives in these kind of interstitial transitional spaces where we're basically just like kind of following people having conversations through the city and different sites, and yeah, so much of it is in movement. I feel like the camera is barely ever static. It's kind of always moving, always following people, even in, you know, a scene where there are two people sitting and kind of going through a scene, the camera is kind of constantly back and forth between the two. And yeah, I just wanted to hear about how, I mean, it sounds like that's just been part of the process of just kind of being there, trying out different things, filming a lot. But yeah, if you could just kind of comment on that kind of constant movement through space.
I think there is really a political statement in the idea of movement that is to coming back to the figure of the storyteller by Édouard Glissant and other writer. Yes, to talk about the movement in the film, I think there is a different way to come to that. And the first one that I would like to address is really the idea of the tradition of the Creole storyteller, which is a figure that is a descendant of the Maroon culture. That means that people that have been always obliged to move to create their life and not living from a place to another, but being always in a movement that create a really specific relationship with the notion of landscape that could be developed too, because I think it's also an issue of the film, the relationship between body and the landscape of the film. But I would say that process of moving as a process of making is really important, and there is something that is important also in the film is also in Haiti, because there is a long trip, you know, from Jura to through the ocean to Port-au-Prince. And after in the countryside, I will talk about this last segment that's been coming out from Haiti. And I think it's really important in the Haitian culture and the political context that Port-au-Prince is a kind of republic for the Haitians. That means there is a concentration of a lot of political, economical power. And it's really that city that has been also really influenced by the Western. It has been also a place for a colonial place. And so coming out from the cities to the countryside, which is called in Haitian pays en dehors. That means the country outside of the country. That means as if the countryside will be the outside of that country, which is Port-au-Prince, is a really significant in the political level, because we have to remember for a really long time in the Haitian historiography, there was a fight in between in the historiography of the revolution, in between the heroes who are coming mostly from the urban context and the Maroon army and the slave fighting too, that were symbolically people from the countryside. So also moving from the cities is also moving from a certain way of telling the story based on the heroes to go in certain way to the people. So that was also the idea, and I film the ensemble is also the result of the decomposition of the figure of the statue of the hero to create that commons. So the movement of the film created that, and I love that last part with the idea of all the part of the Haitian society came together after a kind of, of movement towards the outside of the film, I would say.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And I think also segues nicely to the end, well, not quite the very end, but the scene right before that. We have, is that what you call the rah-rah orchestras when everyone comes together at the very end? So yeah, I'd love to hear you speak more about the role of music in the film. It's super layered. We have Baroque, we have, the characters themselves performing rap, and there's trap in it, and the Monteverdi, and there's just so much going on. So can you unpack some of that?
Yeah, I can talk a bit about the musical choices in the film. I mean, the film itself, actually, the name Ouvertures has many different meanings, but one of them is also from obviously a musical sense, like as if we're creating the overture to, a kind of operatic piece of art or something musical. As in, like the overture to a piece of music.
Yeah, but also ensemble is very, we think of that in terms of jazz and
yeah, of course. And actually, exactly. And then the choice of the word ensemble is as the way to sort of group us together comes from music, exactly, from jazz ensembles, but also from classical music ensembles as well. And also ensemble exactly was taken from a musical sense because we didn't really think that we didn't like to think of ourselves as a collective, because I think we were following collective methods of working, but not actually, we don't function as a collective as such, more as an ensemble, in the sense that, Olivier and I are quite clear that we direct, especially with this film, we directed what the film was to be about and how it was going to, unfold as such. But then the individuals that were taking part in that process are there almost as soloists, who can come in and be incorporated into the production of the piece as a whole. And then in that sense, we tried to find a form of, I suppose, more sort of dissonance, and kind of cacophony, rather than any, sort of whatever. Ordered form, but yeah, and then the music. Anyway, the music throughout the film is used as a sort of, obviously, as a narrational device. I mean, often I like to use music in films as a way to give like a sort of if I could say, a kind of like stratigraphic layering of the image. So if you imagine, you have an image on a vertical, on a horizontal, plane. But then I like to think about then the way that you can read the image might recede back into it. So for example, music then becomes this atmosphere that might surround that horizontal plane. And then the music might then actually create a sort of three-dimensionality to the comprehension of the image, and how it sort of recedes into time and space. So with things like Monteverdi, for example, what you're actually listening to is a specific adagio from Monteverdi's opera Orpheus. It's the moment in which Orpheus actually goes into a cave, or goes into the land of the dead. And he gets confronted with the entrance into the world of the dead, and he actually can't enter into it. He has to sing a piece of music in order to be allowed to enter into the land of the dead, or the world of the dead. And actually, he plays his musical instrument, and he plays it so beautifully that apparently he could make rocks cry, he could make rocks weep. So I thought that was a really very beautiful understanding of, rocks having emotions and a sort of consciousness, insofar as they would cry when they heard a beautiful piece of music. And that's the moment in the film, in Ouvertures, when you see the actor, Jeff de Camille, entering into this hole in the cave, and then he comes out on the other side, and well, the film comes out on the other side, and it transfers us to Haiti. So in that sense, Monteverdi's Orfeo is used to add a sort of narrational depth to those images, let's say. Also just a moment of aesthetic, you know, sheer sort of beauty to listen to those notes while looking at that cave. And then anyway, but that's a bit old fashioned. It's a bit old school to have sort of like Baroque opera. So then to kind of counterbalance that, it felt more interesting to bring that in. So then we hear little bits of Baroque later when we're in Haiti, but also to start to incorporate elements to music that we were picking up whilst we were there. So yeah, we actually hear Haitian trap by a band called G-Shit. G-Shit are a group, you know, of people that were making music quite rapidly at that point when we were in Haiti. So every like week or so there'd be like a new song coming out, and we were introduced to the music each time by the Haitian members of the ensemble, and every time we would hear a new track each week, and then we would listen to pretty much that one track all week on repeat again and again and again. So that Haitian trap actually then became the soundtrack as such to those moments in Haiti. And so then those elements get drawn into the film also as the way to place us very much within the present tense in Haiti. And then exactly, we have musical performances too, and then later in the end of the film we have the Rah-Rah orchestra. And the Rah-Rah orchestra is very significant, actually. I mean, Rah-Rah orchestras, you know, are also part of Haitian voodoo culture. And in fact, when you follow a Rah-Rah orchestra, because it's a band that performs in the street, and they walk through the streets, and people sort of, you know, kind of collect and gather. So also this idea around the sort of forming of a collective, or a sort of temporary collective, like assemblage, assembly, like around a performed piece of music. And we were trying to think actually how the film itself might function a little bit like a Rah-Rah orchestra. But also when you follow the Rah-Rah band through the streets, the Rah-Rah band has to stop at each crossroad. When you're going through Port-au-Prince, there's lots of crossroads. Each time you meet a crossroad, the Rah-Rah band has to stop and do a performance there. And this actually has a relationship to this idea of being at the crossroads of the world, the world of the spirits, and the world of the living, the land of the dead. And actually, one of the voodoo spirits that stays at the crossroad is called Legba, and we hear a mention of Legba in the film quite a few times. Legba is the one that has the key to open up, and it's the person you have to give a salutation to before you can enter into the world of the spirits or enter into communication. And Legba was also apparently a spirit that had a close relationship with Toussaint L'Ouverture. L'Ouverture's name in French means the opening, l'ouverture. Because apparently L'Ouverture had this wonderful military tactic of opening up a battlefield and sending his troops down the middle. But also because L'Ouverture was the one that had the powers to open the future for the country and the Republic of Haiti. So in some respects, there's also this sort of relationship of the Rah-Rah band, the crossroad, Legba, the key, L'Ouverture, Ouvertures, the opening up to a new possible future. So again, music as this kind of narrational depth to the images.
Yeah, thanks. So we only have a little bit of time left, and I'd love for you to touch on the Mamandio character and the idea of writing in kind of a lost history of the role of women in the revolution.
Yeah, I think we can answer it in a different way, but one way would be also to consider that a film, it's a kind of melting from the, let's say, patriarchal figure of the heroes. So from a high C world where all the idols are really solid, the film become more and more liquid. And that liquidity is also the figure of Maman Lo, Maman Dio. It depends on in the Caribbean context. So let's say, I will say that there is a kind of storytelling coming from also historically from a masculine way of telling the story. That means really rigid way of archiving things. And it's also a battle between men, because we have to figure that there is also the letters that we see at the beginning of the film is a letter that L'Ouverture wrote to Napoleon. And it had a really specific relationship with Napoleon in between admiration and hatred. So it was really a kind of mirror fight in between two powerful men. And so I do think of course, the Haitian Revolution included a lot of women. Some of them are known, but a lot of other people are really in the middle of that people from the countryside, that people on the Maroon. So people wouldn't have any name. And so, in fact, in the process of the film is coming from the well-known figures and the really things that have been identified by the process of making the story with a statue, text, to a kind of unknown collectivity, which is, I think, the base of the community in the sense of a political sense of creating commons. And in the middle of that, there is also the conversation in between Diavola and Cynthia. And that came also, as Louis told at the beginning about the story of the spiral. What we try all during the process of the film at some point is try to reintroduce in the film some side conversation. Normally, when you are working on the film, people are talking about a lot of things they like, things they don't like, and so extra. And so there is also that the way of making that film is also, I like to call it a practice of attention, which is I do things, for me, is a real heritage of the feminism, for sure, that the relationship will be attentive on details that have been forgotten in the storytelling, which is also how a lot of radical feminists talk about making the stories in that perspective, be more attentive of something. And so the scene with Cynthia and Diavola came also from the fact that we have been attentive on some conversation they had on the side of our collective practice, really often in Creole, considering that we didn't understand what they were saying. And so at some point we asked them, okay, it's a good conversation, why don't you say it in the film instead of saying it against the play or against the film? So saying that the film got that kind of porosity, and we talk about the idea of ouverture, and so at the end there is a plural of ouvertures. So some conversation I enter in, and I do hope it's also a way to have a feminine and a feminist voice in the film, which in the context of Haiti is really ambitious, because I think it's for some friend of ours in Europe seeing the film says, okay, those women just saying that basic things about the women representation, but it's a real statement in the context of Haiti to say that. It's really something. Yeah. It's really something. It's really ambitious, and it's socially really ambitious. So I think it's also interesting to note that Sophony, Cynthia, and Diavola, because now the three women involved in the project, will also propose something else at the very now, because our relationship have been developed in another direction. We know each other much more, and so they're able to be even more ambitious in what they can propose in the process of it. So when I see that, I say, oh, okay, I'm sure if I would ask them now to do something, it will be much more stronger again. So there is a kind of process of trust too, to be able to address that kind of feminist question in the film. In the Haitian context, it's also a kind of, it's a proof of trust in between us. So we're happy to have it. But you will see in the next project they can produce much more of the really fascinating things. Yeah, they are really strong.
There's just one thing I want to say about that, just very quickly, because actually it describes really nicely the way that we actually treated directing as well in the film. And it also answers a bit more just back to an earlier question you asked about camera and why the camera is like constantly mobile and moving. And also like that space is again one of these transitory peripheral spaces. So the whole film is filmed partly in the center of Port-au-Prince, but a lot of the time in these peripheral spaces in the outskirts, and then further into the countryside. But actually, with that scene, so like Olivier said, Duvilla and Cynthia had been having this conversation about the role of women in the revolution, the underrepresentation. And they thought that this character of Maman Dio that Glissant had written was someone that, for him, was a sort of insertion into that history as a way to narrativize the role of women. And we found that very interesting. And we said, you know, let's do this as a scene. So they would go home in the evening and they wrote that scene together, or they wrote a sort of, how would you put it, a kind of theoretical, historical, you know, statement about women in the revolution. And then we came the next day, we met early in the morning there in Carrefour by the water, and we would just do a take. Like we would just do so I'd say to them, okay, just stand here and and we would do the rehearsals in shooting, right? And we would do maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 takes. And each time we did the take, I'm walking backwards filming. And bear in mind, we don't have any assistants when we film, right? It's me and Olivier and there's someone doing the sound. So Olivier, and I like this, literally had my back. He's like got my back, literally had my back. And he's walking and kind of supporting me. And then the way in which this particular mise en scène, so what landscape and background makes this atmosphere for this text to be spoken in, is actually dictated and organized by Cynthia and Duvilla, because they have been asked beforehand to walk in any direction they basically want. So, and I have to be sensitive to noticing which way they might turn, left or right. And I have to, but I'm not following them. That's the difference. It's not like a documentary method of following people and filming them while they talk. It's also not a pure fiction method where you have a track in the camera and there's a space the actors have to walk through. It's a sort of mixing of both, whereby the actors have complete free reign to choose where they walk and what they say. And it's up to Olivier and I, with the production methods we have, to sort of orchestrate that movement with my body, with Olivier's body, with Cynthia, Duvilla, the camera, and then on top of that, the clouds, the sun, the palm trees, the birds, the goats, the sea, and everything that surrounds it and makes the mise en scène is actually kind of pushing us within a certain space. So, so I would say that the way that those scenes get developed is that's very much, I think, a sort of collective mode of authoring an image in cinema, in the sense that it's written and it's very much, it's a fictional, it has a fictional desire in terms of what it's trying to narrate, but that fiction is open enough to allow the space around it to kind of direct it. So in the end, we get directed. I think Olivier and I like, and Olivier said this elsewhere, the situations we're often filming in far supersede the production. You know, the production's like 3 people. The Rara was like 100 people. So the environment, the landscape takes over in some respects and directs us and moves us. Right. And so then the camera has to be constantly like on the move. The camera has to be almost on
responding.
The run. Yeah. Basically.
Yeah, that's really nice. Well, thank you both so much for opening up all these fascinating aspects of the film and sharing them with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions.
Yeah, really great to talk with you. I wish we were all here in person, and sadly, I feel like every time I've seen the film, I was just thinking today when I was watching it, I wish I could have seen it in the cinema, because it really feels like it deserves like a big screen. But hopefully one day we'll get it in the cinema.
No, for sure, we will come back to New York to do so.
Yeah.
Great.
Just to hear that Haitian trap on the sound system, it's
oh my gosh,
it's better. Anyway,
Yes.
Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you
Thank
both
you.
so much.
Thank you. So see you soon.
Take care.
Bye-bye.